The long-awaited evening had arrived when a group of friends, Jack, Mika, Tony, and Rachel, gathered at a trendy bar in Greenwich to celebrate their university graduation. Inside the establishment, an atmosphere of fun prevailed, bright lights twinkled, and music filled the space with energetic rhythms, making people move in sync. Each of them felt that this moment would become an important milestone in their lives, symbolizing the transition into adulthood and all the new opportunities it promised. At a table surrounded by friendly laughter and jokes, they discussed their plans when a stranger approached them. Laura, a tall and attractive girl with wavy hair and a bright smile, quickly captured their attention. She introduced herself and, with sincere enthusiasm, invited them to a party she was hosting at her home. Rachel, always eager for new acquaintances and adventures, was the first to respond to the invitation. She looked at her friends with excitement, urging them to join. "Why not?" she said with a smile. The others, noticing how Laura had engaged in the conversation and the atmosphere around them, began to succumb to the mood. Jack, naturally more cautious, initially expressed doubt but soon found himself swept up in the general enthusiasm. "We graduated, we need to celebrate properly," exclaimed Tony, winking. His optimism was contagious, and soon the group agreed to head to the party. Laura, pleased with their agreement, offered to call a taxi to take them to her apartment. During the ride, curiosity filled them. Each wondered what awaited them at this party. A sense of excitement hung in the air as they discussed what adventures lay ahead, as if something extraordinary was about to happen. Upon arriving at Laura's cozy apartment, they noticed the door slightly ajar and music coming from inside. Laura cheerfully swung the doors open and led them into a spacious living room filled with a relaxing atmosphere. The music played softly enough to allow conversation, and other guests were already gathering, laughing, and enjoying the party. As they entered, Laura introduced her friends, and soon they began engaging in conversations with new acquaintances. It seemed the party was just getting started, and the anticipation of new connections filled their hearts. But deep down, Jack felt a slight unease. He couldn't shake the thought that something about the situation was a bit off. However, trying not to dampen the overall fun, he decided to just relax and enjoy the moment. The dream party was only beginning, and the friends were ready to immerse themselves in its atmosphere. As the group of friends stepped into Laura's chic home, they were struck by its luxury. The interior was designed in a modern style with Art Deco elements, high ceilings, elegant light fixtures, luxurious paintings on the walls, and stylish furniture. Huge windows opened up views of the nighttime city, with stars twinkling in the sky, adding a touch of magic to the atmosphere. Noticing her friends' admiration, Laura smiled proudly and led them to the bar, which was overflowing with snacks and drinks. "Welcome to my world," she said, pouring each of them a cocktail. As they sipped their drinks, other guests approached them. Laura introduced her friends, and among them stood a mysterious guy named Chris. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to see right through them. Chris smiled and confidently greeted each of them, bringing a slight tension to the conversation. His presence drew attention, and Mika felt that he was not just another guest but something more. At first, the party was lively. People laughed, danced, and exchanged jokes, and the atmosphere was filled with light and joy. The friends became engaged in the fun, striking up conversations with other guests. Tony, always energetic and sociable, quickly started a friendly chat with a few new acquaintances, sharing stories from their university days. However, as time passed and the evening progressed, something changed in the atmosphere. The music became slightly quieter, and conversations grew less cheerful. Jack noticed some guests starting to glance at each other as if some of them felt out of place. He scanned the room and caught Chris watching him with deep interest. A shadow of something mysterious flickered in his eyes, which unsettled Jack. Mika, noticing the shift in mood, tried to cheer her friends up by suggesting a game, but even her enthusiasm couldn't restore the previous joy. Laura noticed that conversations had turned to whispers, and some guests began to pull away from groups as if fearing something. An odd feeling arose as if something unclear and sinister lingered in the room. Chris, not taking his eyes off Jack, suddenly approached closer. "You don't seem very happy here," he said with a cryptic smile. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Chris's words made him ponder that this party might not be as harmless as it first seemed. The internal unease grew, and he began to realize that with each passing moment, The tension in the room was escalating. As soon as Laura disappeared into one of the rooms, the tension in the air became even more palpable. The group of friends looked around, trying to understand what was happening. At first, they had dismissed it, but soon they noticed that other guests were also starting to behave strangely. The laughter that had once echoed throughout the house gradually faded, replaced by a cautious silence. Jack and Mika exchanged worried glances. It became clear to them that something was wrong. As if on cue, the guests began to cluster in small groups, whispering to each other. At that moment, Ben, one of Laura's friends, a muscular guy with a cocky demeanor, approached them. His eyes sparkled, and a smirk froze on his face, which suddenly put Jack on edge. "Where's Laura?" Jack asked, trying to sound confident. Ben merely shrugged and, crossing his arms over his chest, looked at the group with obvious discontent. "You guys seem to not understand where you are, do you?" he said with a clear contempt in his voice. This sparked unease among all of them. "What do you mean?" Mika asked, her voice trembling with tension. Ben stepped closer, and Jack felt the air around them grow heavy. "Nobody can just be here for no reason. We're here for business, and you guys seem to have just stumbled into the wrong place," he said, curling his lips in a smirk. The friends exchanged anxious glances. Jack felt his heart race. "We just came to a party, we're not trying to cause any trouble," he said, attempting to suppress his fear. But Ben was not stopping. He continued to approach, his threatening tone becoming increasingly evident. "You know, people like you shouldn't be here. We don't like unnecessary witnesses," he said, crossing his arms and leaning toward Jack. Mika tried to intervene. "Listen, we're not looking to cause problems. We just want to have a good time," she said, but her voice sounded uncertain. Ben raised an eyebrow as if mocking their attempt to justify themselves. A tense silence filled the room, and Jack noticed that some guests were already looking away, avoiding the conflict. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," Ben said, his voice low and menacing. He stepped back, and Jack felt his friends huddle together, seeking support from one another. At that moment, the atmosphere of the party had completely changed. It was no longer a carefree celebration, it was now a place filled with anxiety and hidden threats. Seconds stretched in anticipation, and Jack understood that they needed to act. He quickly commanded his friends, "Let's get out of here." But before they could take a step, Ben blocked their way again, and Jack sensed that the situation was about to spiral out of control. An inner voice warned him that they were trapped, and that realization made it all the more terrifying. When the friends finally gathered their thoughts and stepped away from Ben, they sought refuge in one of the rooms. The door clicked shut behind them, and at that moment, as silence enveloped them, anxiety mounted. They all understood that what was happening had nothing to do with a typical party. It felt as if dark clouds were gathering above them, and each of them sensed that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. "Did you notice how everyone suddenly started acting strange?" Mika said, her voice trembling with concern. "It was like a conspiracy. As if we were specifically invited here." Jack nodded, pondering her words. He recalled how Chris had looked at them, and a chill ran down his spine. "And Laura? Where is she? Why hasn't she come back?" he added, his anxiety escalating. Rachel, trying to reassure her friends, said, "Maybe she's just busy with something that doesn't concern us. No need to panic. Everything's fine." But her words sounded unconvincing, and they did little to dispel the growing worry. She felt fear creeping into her mind, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible could happen at any moment. "You don't understand, we can't just leave," Tony suddenly exclaimed, his voice shaking with tension. He approached the window and peered outside, but in the darkness, not a soul was in sight. "These people, they won't let us go. We don't know what they have in mind." Panic reflected on the friends' faces. They exchanged glances, realizing they could be trapped. In this luxurious yet oppressive house, they had lost their sense of safety. Jack looked again at the door they had approached. "Maybe we should try to get out through the window?" he suggested. Though he understood that it was risky. Rachel raised her hands, trying to calm the others. "Let's not do anything reckless. We need to stay calm and think logically. Maybe Laura just forgot about us." But her words failed to ease the group. Tension grew, and each began to realize that this party was not just a celebration but something far more sinister. "Listen, I can't stay here," Mika said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to find a way out of here before it's too late." But as soon as she said this, a sound outside resembling footsteps echoed, and they all froze, listening intently. Hearts raced, and it felt as if every breath had become quieter, as if even the air acknowledged the danger. Panic began to grip them, and they exchanged worried looks. "What if they won't let us leave?" Rachel whispered, her eyes glistening with fear. Each of them understood that they might have become part of something that was never meant to happen. At that moment, paranoia swept over them, and they realized they had to act quickly before it was too late. The situation in the apartment had reached a boiling point. The footsteps of Ben and his friends grew louder, and the tension reached a critical level. The group of friends huddled in a small room felt panic wash over them, their hearts beating in unison with fear. At that moment, it was clear that time was running out. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice trembling but filled with determination. "We need to find a way out." He quickly scanned the room for possible escape routes. Mika, holding her phone, tried to find a signal, but there was none. With each passing second, their chances of escape dwindled. "Please, let's just get out through the door," Rachel suggested, her voice full of desperation. But Jack, recalling Ben's threatening glare, knew that wasn't the best option. He turned sharply to his friends and said, "Listen, we need to move. I saw the kitchen, maybe there's a window there." They hurried out of the room, trying to be quiet, and headed toward the kitchen. As they approached, the tension escalated. Every rustle made them freeze, as if the world around them had suddenly paused in anticipation. When they entered the kitchen, Jack glanced at the window and was relieved to see it slightly open. He quickly approached it and tried to push it wider, his fingers gliding over the glass. Mika and Tony rushed to help him pry it open while Rachel stood ready, listening intently to the sounds outside the kitchen. "Come on, hurry," she urged, her voice shaking with anxiety. The friends began to climb out through the window, and as Jack landed outside, he felt the fresh air sharply contrast with the stifling atmosphere inside the apartment. But the moment he hit the ground, his joy was shattered by a shout coming from inside. "Where did they go?" Ben's voice rang out, loud and threatening, and Jack realized their pursuers had started to act. In the same instant, he turned back to his friends, who were still inside. "Faster," he shouted, pulling Mika along so she could climb out. Tony followed suit, and all four quickly looked around, realizing they needed to find shelter. Footsteps echoed behind them, and excitement turned to panic. "We need to hide," Jack said, pointing to a narrow alley next to the house. They rushed into it, feeling adrenaline surge through them. Fear engulfed each of them, and they couldn't allow themselves to look back. As they sprinted down the dark alley, the rustles and shouts of their pursuers grew louder. It seemed they were already on the friends' tails. Jack understood they had no time to waste. Soon, they reached the end of the alley, where an old, abandoned building loomed. "Get inside," he yelled as they crossed the threshold, trying to catch their breath. Hiding in the dark space, the group froze, listening to the sounds outside. It was quiet within, and only their heartbeats resonated in unison as they tried to figure out what to do next. It seemed they had escaped one danger only to fall into another. Exhausted and frightened, the friends rushed onto the roof of the abandoned building. The wind enveloped them instantly, bringing both freshness and terror. They found themselves high above the city, the view before them both mesmerizing and frightening. The lights of Greenwich twinkled in the darkness, while the sounds of the city reached them like echoes of distant worldly concerns. But their problems felt too close. "We need to figure out how to get to safety," Jack said, trying to keep his mind clear. He surveyed the roof, looking for possible exits, but thoughts of their pursuers gnawed at him. In the distance, he heard the footsteps and voices of Ben and his friends, close, and time was running out. Mika, clutching her arms to her chest, nervously glanced around. "Where can we go from here? If we go down, they'll catch us," she said, despair increasingly evident in her voice. Rachel, still holding her phone, tried again to find a signal, but it was futile. It felt like only a few floors separated them from the world. Yet at that moment, they felt imprisoned. Tony, trying to remain calm, suggested, "If we can jump to the next building, maybe we can make it to the street and escape from them." He pointed to a low wall separating them from the adjacent building. Everyone except Jack nodded in agreement. "Okay, but this could be risky. We need to act fast, Jack said, encouraging the others. They began to move toward the edge of the roof, being careful not to attract attention. The footsteps behind them grew louder, and each of them felt the fear mounting. When they reached the edge, Jack looked down and realized that jumping to the neighboring roof would be challenging. "This is going to be a tough leap," he said, clenching his fists. "But we have no other choice." Mika hesitated. "What if we can't land? Or if we fall?" Her voice trembled, and the fear overwhelmed her. But Jack felt he couldn't let panic take over the situation. He looked at his friends, seeing determination but also uncertainty in their eyes. "We'll do this together," he said, filling his voice with confidence. "On three. Ready? 1, 2, 3, he shouted, leaping into the darkness. He landed on the other side, his legs slightly buckling, but he regained his balance and turned around, encouraging his friends. "Come on, go," he yelled. Mika and Rachel didn't hesitate, clenching their fists and jumping after him. Tony, a bit delayed, also followed the impulse and jumped. All four found themselves on the neighboring roof, and Jack instantly felt a sense of relief. But that feeling quickly evaporated when they heard their pursuers' shouts, which seemed to be getting closer. "They're coming after us," Tony shouted, his face pale. They probably had only a few minutes left to escape the roof and find a safe place. "Quick, down the stairs," Jack yelled, pointing to an exit leading down into a dark passageway. They moved toward the stairs, determined to break free from their pursuers' grasp, but they knew that with every second, the mounting tension could be their last. When Jack, Mika, Rachel, and Tony reached the edge of the roof, they exchanged looks filled with resolve and fear. Each of them knew that their chances of survival depended on how quickly they acted. Realizing they needed to jump into the dark alley, Jack stepped back, preparing for the leap. "On three," he said, listening to the shouts behind them. 1, 2, 3, he shouted and jumped into the darkness, his heart racing. The landing was rough, but he quickly got to his feet, checking to ensure the others had followed him. Mika, Rachel, and Tony landed nearby, their faces a mix of relief and fear. They found themselves in a narrow alley surrounded by tall building walls, and darkness closed in around them. Jack turned to his friends to make sure they were okay, but at that moment, footsteps from outside caught his attention. Ben's shouts echoed from a distance, and tension enveloped them again. "We need to move," Jack said, trying to stay calm. "We can't stay in one place." They quickly moved forward, trying to be quiet and stay alert. The alley was dark and grim, and every rustle made them jump. Tony glanced over his shoulder and said, "I hope they didn't see us." But his words offered no reassurance. Each of them felt that at any moment, they could run into their pursuers. The friends passed through the alley and soon discovered it led to the back of one of the buildings. Suddenly, footsteps were heard, and Jack halted abruptly, listening intently. For a moment, everything around them froze, and they felt fear gripping them. "It's them," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Let's get against the wall, maybe they won't see us," Jack suggested, and they pressed against the cold brick wall, holding their breath. It felt like time had stopped, and each of them prayed to remain unnoticed. The footsteps grew closer, and the friends' hearts raced in unison. Suddenly, Ben appeared around the corner of the alley with several of his friends. They were talking among themselves, their faces twisted in displeasure and anger. "Where are they?" Ben said, his voice sounding threatening. He paused for a moment as if instinctively sensing their presence. The friends froze, their fear at its peak. Each of them understood they had no other option. They had to get out of there, but how? Ben and his friends continued searching the alley, and at that moment, Jack felt time slipping away. Thoughts raced through his mind on how to escape and plan their next move. "We have to go," Mika whispered, her voice filled with dread. "If they catch us." She didn't finish the sentence, but it was clear the consequences would be dire. "We need to get back into the city," Tony said, his eyes shining with determination. "There might be more people there. If we can reach the street, someone can help us." Jack nodded, feeling that was the only option. They had to move, even if it meant taking a risk. Gathering their last strength, they decided to dash across the alley, hoping luck would be on their side. Each heart beat like a drum as they stepped forward, preparing for whatever might happen. Their lives depended on that moment, and excitement filled the air around them as they braced for their escape into the unknown. Navigating through the dark streets of Greenwich, the friends felt trapped, as if each step brought them closer to inevitable danger. The streets that had once seemed lively and bright were now shrouded in darkness, their shadows dancing on the cobblestones. They understood that time was not on their side, and anxiety grew with each passing minute. "Where can we find a taxi?" Jack said, his voice filled with worry. They crossed the street, trying to stay in the shadows and avoid the bright streetlights. Mika walked slightly ahead, her eyes searching for signs of life. But the streets were empty, and they had no choice but to keep moving. Rachel glanced at Jack, her face reflecting fear. "If we don't find transportation, we have nowhere to run," she said, raising her voice. "I don't want to stay out here." She stumbled over her words, panic evident in her tone. Tony, sensing the tension, tried to calm her. "We'll manage, just stay close," he said, trying to sound confident. But even he realized that fear gripped them all, and every second stoked their anxiety. Suddenly, the noise came from behind, and they froze. It was footsteps, and Jack instinctively pulled everyone toward the nearest shelter, into the archway of one of the buildings. Clenching their fists, they held their breath, listening to the sounds that grew louder. Each of them hoped it wasn't Ben and his friends, but the tension mounted. "What do we do if they find us?" Mika whispered, her voice trembling. Jack felt his heart pound in sync with her fear. "We need to find a way to get out of here. If they catch us, it will be too late." As soon as the noise faded, the friends decided it was time to move on. They cautiously stepped out of their hiding place and continued their journey. Their steps now more careful. Every movement, every sound felt deafening in the silence of the night. Finally, they reached a busier street, and Jack looked around hopefully for a taxi. "Where are all the cars?" he said, his voice filled with disappointment. The friends began to panic too, their eyes scanning the roadway, but no taxis appeared. "Let's go to the next intersection," Rachel suggested. "There might be a better chance there." They moved forward, trying to keep each other in sight. Their steps quickened, and each of them understood that time was working against them. At the intersection, they saw a few cars, but every taxi passed by, ignoring their desperate looks. "This is just crazy," Tony said, his voice full of despair. "What if they catch us before we can get out of here?" "We can't give up," Jack shouted, his eyes blazing with determination. "We'll find a way to leave." He approached the nearest car, but seeing the driver's displeased expression, he realized the taxi wouldn't stop just like that. "Wherever we go, we need to do it now," he said, his voice becoming resolute. Suddenly, a pedestrian approached, looking panicked as well. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing their worried faces. "It's not safe here. We're looking for a taxi to get out of here," Mika exclaimed, her voice filled with hope. The pedestrian nodded, but his expression didn't offer reassurance. "Better to move on, it's too dangerous here," he said before quickly leaving them alone with their growing fear. The friends looked at each other again. "We need to act while we still have a chance," Jack said, and they set off again, hearts pounding with fear but also hope. In their minds, one thought prevailed: they couldn't give up while there was still a chance to escape this trap. The friends stood at the street corner, nervously glancing at each other while waiting for a taxi. Their hearts raced, and every sound felt like an ominous sign. Jack struggled to remain calm, but the mounting anxiety wouldn't leave him. They knew they had to leave, but the waiting had become a true test. "Where is that taxi?" Tony said, his voice sounding cautious. "We've been here forever." Suddenly, he stepped back, as if contemplating, then added, "I'm going to check the street a bit." "Don't go too far," Rachel warned, her voice filled with concern. But Tony, casting one last look at them, headed toward a dark alley. The friends watched him until his figure disappeared into the shadows. Minutes passed, and the tension mounted. Mika kept looking around, but the taxi still hadn't arrived. "Where is he? Why isn't he back yet?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. Jack felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. "Maybe he just needed a little time," he said, trying to reassure everyone. But even he understood that each moment was becoming more tense. Another few minutes passed, and Tony still hadn't returned. The friends began exchanging glances filled with worry. "I don't like this," Rachel said, her voice low and tense. "We need to find him." "I'll go after him," Jack said, his determination evident. He turned to his friends, "Stay here and watch the road. I'll check what's going on." With those words, he headed into the dark alley where Tony had vanished. The darkness in the alley was frightening. Each step Jack took echoed, and he listened for any sounds, but only silence surrounded him. He felt the anxiety mounting, and his heart raced in his chest. Suddenly, he stopped and listened. No sounds. The silence pressed down on him. Tony couldn't just disappear. Jack continued walking, his thoughts racing. What if something happened to him? He whispered to himself, quickening his pace. He knew their pursuers could be nearby, and that feeling made him nervous. He reached the end of the alley and looked around. Nothing. Just the shadowy silhouettes of buildings and the distant twinkling of lights. "Tony!" he shouted, but only silence answered him. It reminded him of how vulnerable they were in this situation. Returning, he saw Mika and Rachel exchanging worried glances. "Where's Tony?" Rachel asked, her voice full of fear. "I don't know, I couldn't find him," Jack said, feeling a chill run down his spine. "He just disappeared." At that moment, they all understood the situation was becoming critical. Horror gripped them, and each of them realized they had become targets. "We need to get out of here," Mika said, her voice ringing out in the night's silence. "We can't stay here. I can't just leave without knowing what happened to him," Jack replied, his determination clear. He looked around, and in that moment, an idea struck him. "We can split up. I'll go look for Tony, and you stay here and call a taxi." "No, Jack, that's dangerous," Rachel shouted, but Jack, no longer listening to them, stepped confidently back into the alley. He knew the risk was great, but leaving a friend was even worse. As he plunged back into the darkness, his heart raced with fear but also hope. He knew he had to find Tony before it was too late. One question echoed in his mind: what had happened to his friend? Each step felt like a challenge, and Jack understood that in the darkness lay more than just danger. Jack, immersed in the darkness of the alley, felt his heart racing in his chest. Thoughts of Tony consumed him, and he realized that time was against them. He pressed forward, listening to every rustle, hoping to find his friend soon. He paused for a moment, crouching to get a better look at his surroundings. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, causing him to tense up. It was a scream, vague and filled with fear. He got to his feet, making a decision: he had to follow the sound. Meanwhile, Mika, who remained outside, couldn't stand idly by. With determination, she resolutely set off after Jack. She understood that he needed help, and no matter how dangerous it was, she couldn't leave her friend alone. Navigating through the dark streets, they finally came to an open area. Jack saw Tony, bound and held by Ben. A wave of anxiety surged in his heart as he noticed Tony struggling to break free. Ben loomed over him, a smirk on his face, full of smugness and cruelty. "You'll never get out of here," Ben said, his voice dripping with menace. Tony looked at him with horror and rage but couldn't do anything. Jack froze, realizing they didn't have time to waste. He turned to Mika, her eyes filled with fear but also determination. "We have to act now," he whispered, pointing at Ben. Mika nodded, her gaze filled with readiness. Jack quickly devised a plan. They needed to distract Ben to give Tony a chance to escape. He raised his hand and, trying not to draw attention, shouted, "Hey, Ben. You don't think this will end so easily, do you?" Ben turned, his face contorted in surprise. This gave Tony a bit of time. Mika, seizing the moment, dashed forward, grabbing an empty bottle from the ground and throwing it at Ben. The bottle smashed against the wall nearby, shattering into pieces. "What the hell?" Ben yelled, distracted from Tony. At that moment, Jack rushed to his friend, helping him break free. They strained together, and Tony finally managed to free his hands. But Ben, realizing his plan was thwarted, shouted, "You won't get away from me." He lunged at them, but Jack and Tony had already managed to sidestep. At the last moment, they narrowly avoided his grasp. The fight was inevitable. Jack felt the tension rising, and the air was thick with adrenaline. Ben, refusing to back down, continued to attack, but Jack and Tony worked together, trying to keep Ben at bay. "Run, go, Mika, get out of here," Jack shouted, knowing their chances of rescue were diminishing with each passing second. At that moment, he noticed Ben lunging forward, and their eyes met. Jack felt adrenaline surge through him as he charged at Ben, grabbing his shoulder and shoving him aside. Everything happened quickly. Jack and Tony, joining forces, managed to push Ben away, but he was not willing to give up. They stepped back just as Ben, enraged, charged at them. At the last moment, Jack saw Ben trip over a stone and, losing his balance, fall to the ground. "Quick!" Jack yelled, and the friends wasted no time, sprinting toward the street. Mika was waiting for them at the corner, her face illuminated with concern, but as soon as she saw them, relief washed over her. "Tony!" she screamed, running to them. They huddled together, unable to believe they had escaped. But at that moment, Jack sensed that something was off. Danger still lingered around them, and they understood that this was only a reprieve. "We need to find a taxi before Ben comes to," Jack said, and they dashed off again in search of an exit, knowing that this night would leave an indelible mark on their lives. Each of them realized that many dangers lay ahead, but they were ready to face them together, no longer as individuals, but as a true team. As the friends settled into the taxi, the sense of safety didn't come. Despite having escaped danger, fear and adrenaline still coursed through their veins. Jack, sitting in the front seat, stared out the window, watching the dark streets of Greenwich flicker by like a haze. Mika and Rachel sat in the back, their faces pale, exchanging worried glances. Tony looked dejected, his gaze wandering around the taxi as if searching for answers that wouldn't come. "What just happened?" Rachel said, her voice soft yet insistent. "How could we end up in this situation?" "It's all Ben," Jack said, his voice filled with anger and concern. "He was plotting something. Maybe all this time we were just pawns in his game." He recalled Ben's smirk and how he had threatened Tony, and it weighed heavily on his heart. "But why did he choose us?" Mika asked, her voice trembling with fear. "What could we have done to provoke his wrath?" "We might not have done anything," Tony said, diverting his gaze from the window. "But we still need to understand what happened. We have to gather evidence." He looked at Jack as if urging him to take action. Jack nodded, trying to gather his thoughts. "We need to figure out who else was with him at the party. We have to understand what their connection is and what they might know." He remembered the mysterious Chris, who had seemed suspicious to him. If Ben was in collusion with someone, it could explain their behavior. The taxi stopped at a traffic light, and Jack looked out the window at the passers-by. "We could try to find others who were at the party," he continued. "Maybe someone saw or heard something strange. What if they're also in danger?" Rachel noted, her voice full of concern. "What if Ben is already watching us?" "We need to be careful," Jack said, aware of the seriousness of the situation. "But if we don't do something, it could happen again. We can't let others become victims." Feeling a surge of determination, Mika said, "We can use social media. Let's try to find information about the party. Maybe someone has already shared something unusual." She pulled out her phone, ready to enter a query. The taxi moved again, and the friends continued discussing their plans, finding this to be the only way to cope with their anxiety. Jack understood that time was running out and they needed to act quickly. "We should meet up and discuss this once we get to a safe place. Maybe we have a chance to find someone who was there." At that moment, the taxi stopped in front of the building where they had rented an apartment. As they got out, the air felt fresh, but the aura of anxiety still hung in the atmosphere. Jack looked at his friends, each of whom appeared confused and frightened. Yet determination shone in their eyes. "We'll get through this," he said, trying to instill confidence in the others. "We'll figure out what happened and find a way to protect ourselves." These were words of hope that everyone needed at that moment. They entered the apartment, and Jack immediately pulled out his laptop to start searching for information. The excitement mounted, and each of them understood that something greater than just solving a problem lay ahead. This was a real fight for safety and truth, and only together could they face the darkness that was closing in on them. The next morning, the friends tried to return to normal life, but an air of anxiety still lingered. Jack, Mika, Tony, and Rachel sat around the kitchen table, attempting to enjoy breakfast, but their thoughts were haunted by the horrors of the previous night. Every rustle and every movement put them on edge. They understood that normal life was no longer an option. "Everything feels so strange," Rachel said, setting her coffee cup aside. "It feels like someone is watching us." The others exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a shared concern. Maybe it's just the aftermath of stress, Tony attempted to reassure them, though he felt anxiety bubbling inside. We've been under a lot of pressure, and our nerves are stretched thin. Lost in thought, Jack suddenly said, "We need to figure out who Laura is." She was the link in this situation. They all knew that Laura was the one who had led them to the dangerous party, and this decision seemed logical. But how are we going to do that? Mika asked, raising an eyebrow. She was just an acquaintance, and we have no evidence. Not quite, Jack replied, igniting a spark of hope. There are her friends. We can try to find out who they are and what role they played in her life. His voice carried determination, and despite their fear, the friends felt a surge of confidence. After breakfast, they gathered around the computer, exploring social media. Each of them knew that they needed to find something that could reveal the truth about Laura and her circle. Jack began by searching for her profile on Facebook. Soon, he stumbled upon a page filled with party photos and many mutual acquaintances. "Look at this," he said, showing the screen. "There are a lot of people who might know something about her." He started clicking through the photos, and everyone's attention was drawn to one in particular. Laura was pictured hugging a guy who looked like Chris. "That's him, Chris," Mika exclaimed, pointing at the photo. "He was at the party. Maybe he knows something?" However, as they delved deeper into his profile, their expectations were dashed. Chris appeared to be a reserved person, posting almost nothing about himself. His account looked empty and mysterious, as if he was carefully hiding his life from outsiders. "We could try to find him in real life," Rachel suggested. "Maybe he has some regular places where he hangs out." At that moment, Jack felt that this idea might be too risky, but they had no other options. They decided to spend the rest of the day searching for information about Laura and her friends, hoping to stumble upon a clue. As they left the apartment, Jack felt the sensation of someone watching them. He turned around, but no one was behind him. Still, anxiety wouldn't leave him. In the evening, the group gathered in the apartment to discuss their findings and devise a plan of action. They had new clues to investigate. They began sharing the results of their searches, trying to piece together the bigger picture. "We need to find out where Laura studied and who she interacted with," Jack said, opening a browser. "Maybe someone she knows has information." Mika took her phone to call the university. "I'll try to find out if they have any records about her. Maybe teachers or classmates remember her." Meanwhile, Tony noticed that someone had left a comment under one of Laura's photos. "Look, it's some Kyle," he said, pointing at the screen. "He looks familiar. Maybe he was at the party too?" Excited, Rachel suggested, "We could try to contact him. If he was with her recently, maybe he knows what happened." They decided to send him a message, hoping he would respond. As they waited, a tense silence fell over the room. Each of them understood that their time was running out. Ben and his friends could return at any moment. Finally, a new message appeared in the chat. It was a response from Kyle. "Hey. Yes, I know Laura. How can I help?" The friends' hearts raced. They knew this could be their chance to uncover the truth. "We need to meet with him," Jack said, his voice resolute. "This might be our only chance to find out what happened." They gathered together to discuss the details of the meeting. They agreed on a place within reach and set a time. Excitement filled them, but there was also a sharp need to find answers. As they parted ways, Jack felt once again that someone was watching them. He turned around but saw no one again. "It's nothing," he told himself. "It's just a trick of the mind." But inside, the fear remained that they might be facing something more dangerous than they could imagine. The next morning, filled with hope and anxiety, the friends met Kyle at a small cafe on the corner. The place was noisy, but the atmosphere was tense. Jack, Mika, Tony, and Rachel waited for their potential informant to arrive. When Kyle walked in, he looked anxious, and his face showed that he understood the gravity of the situation. He sat down with them and quickly glanced around. "You shouldn't be here," he said, lowering his voice. "It's dangerous. We know that Laura and her friends might be involved in something serious." Jack began, trying to remain calm. "Can you tell us what you know?" Kyle took a deep breath. "Laura and her crew are connected to a criminal gang. They're involved in abductions." These words hung in the air, and each of the friends felt a chill run down their spines. "Abductions? How is that possible?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I didn't believe it at first either," Kyle continued, clenching his hands. But they have their methods. They use parties to lure people in. Laura always seemed strange to me, but I never thought she could be part of this. And what do you know about Ben and the others? Tony asked, tension building. Ben is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a few others who do the dirty work. If you've witnessed something, they might decide you're no longer needed, Kyle said, his voice sounding anxious. Now everything felt different. The friends realized they had become part of a dangerous game and needed to act. We need to confront Laura and get answers, Jack said, his determination growing. We can't just leave it like this. Kyle looked at them skeptically. You don't understand what you're getting into. They won't forgive you. And what, should we just sit back? We're already in danger, Mika exclaimed, her voice filled with anger. Kyle nodded, but his face showed doubt. Fine, I can help you find them, but you need to be careful. These people don't play around. In the evening, they met Kyle at the old warehouse he had mentioned. This place had once been used for storage, but now it looked abandoned and neglected. Darkness enveloped the area, and every movement seemed loud in the dead silence. They won't be here, but this is where they often gather, Kyle said, looking around. We can wait until someone shows up. The friends hid behind empty crates, trying to remain quiet. Excitement and fear overwhelmed them. Every rustle, every shadow made their hearts race. I hope this is worth it, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. It took some time before they began to hear voices. They froze, listening intently. That's them, Jack said quietly as Laura, Ben, and a few other familiar faces entered the room. I told you they can't stay here, they heard Ben's voice. Laura replied, her tone cold, we can't underestimate them. They might know more than we think. The friends exchanged glances, and in that moment, Jack's resolve took over. It's time to act, he said, and they sprang from their hiding place. What are you doing here? Ben shouted as they stepped out of the shadows. Laura turned to them, her face twisted in anger. We came for answers, Mika shouted, though fear still gripped her heart. You don't understand what you're doing, Laura said, her voice becoming threatening. The friends realized they had gone too far, but it was too late. Soon, the tension escalated into a confrontation. Ben lunged at Tony, who, caught off guard, fell to the ground. Jack rushed forward to help his friend, but Laura blocked his path. You should have stayed out of this, she screamed, raising her hand as if to strike. The situation escalated. The friends realized they would now have to fight for their lives. We won't give up, Jack exclaimed as he lunged at Laura. At that moment, adrenaline surged through his body, and he knew that if they wanted to survive, they had to act quickly and decisively. Mika and Rachel had already started grappling with Ben and his accomplices. Shouts and sounds of struggle echoed throughout the space. Tony, despite having fallen, got back up and rushed to help Jack. We need to get out of here, he shouted, helping his friend to his feet. They won't stop. Suddenly, the tension reached its peak when one of Ben's friends, noticing them, pulled out a knife. Jack and Tony jumped aside, and for a moment, they found themselves on the brink of defeat. But then, seizing the moment, Mika grabbed a heavy object and threw it at the assailant. This gave the friends the chance to regroup and begin acting together. Each friend knew that their lives were at stake, and they acted as one. Mutual support and unity became their greatest strength. Eventually, they managed to gain the upper hand. Realizing they couldn't deal with this team, Ben and his gang began to retreat, but it was no easy task. This isn't over, Ben shouted, his eyes filled with fury. You won't get away from us that easily. However, Jack, gathering his strength, said, we're not afraid anymore. His voice sounded confident, and that confidence spread to the others. Regrouping, they dashed toward the exit, realizing that this time they had truly escaped the trap. They knew many dangers still lay ahead, but now they were ready to face everything together. The morning after the confrontation with Laura and her crew, the friends gathered at Jack's apartment. The windows were open, and fresh air filled the room, but it couldn't dispel the darkness that still lingered in their hearts. Each of them was lost in thought, processing the events of the previous night. We did it, Tony finally said, his voice quiet but firm. We survived, but the joy of victory offered no comfort. Rachel, sitting on the edge of the sofa, looked up and said, but what now? We can't just go back to our normal lives. Everything has changed. The friends exchanged glances, and a shared thought reflected in their eyes. They understood that their world would never be the same. The anxiety and fear of what they had endured ran too deep to simply be left in the past. "I still can't believe Laura was a part of this," Jack said, his voice full of disbelief. "How could we not notice? All this time she seemed normal," Mika added, her voice trembling. "Or maybe she was normal until she got involved with them. Quote. But what if there are others who could become victims?" Rachel spoke, and everyone understood that this was what troubled them most. "We can't let this happen to anyone else." The friends began discussing how they could help. They realized they had to use their experience to prevent similar situations. "We could create a support group or even volunteer," Tony suggested, his eyes lighting up with the idea. "It will be difficult," Mika noted, but her voice held a glimmer of hope. "But if we work together, we can do something meaningful." They decided they needed to reach out to local organizations focused on safety and protection. "We have to warn people about what's happening," Jack said. "Together, we can spread the word and help those in need." In the weeks that followed, the friends began to work actively. They met with representatives from organizations, gathering information on how to support and protect people who might be in danger. Each meeting and each conversation filled them with new strength and purpose. Residents also began reaching out to them after hearing their stories. They shared their experiences and fears, which only strengthened their resolve. The friends understood that their experience could help many facing threats, just as they had. With each passing day, they grew more confident in their decision. Each new connection, each story of how they had helped someone, restored their hope. Now, after everything they had been through, they knew they could overcome any difficulties together. "We're not alone," Jack said one evening as they discussed their progress. "We have each other and all these people who need help." They looked at each other and realized that now, even after all the trials, they had become stronger. Their friendship, forged in fire, had proven to be more resilient than ever. New challenges awaited them, but they knew they could face any threat together. Thus, their lives, though forever changed, found new meaning and purpose. They didn't just survive, they chose to act and help others, making the world a little safer for everyone.